When Germany capitulated on May 8, 1945, the Japanese now had to face the entire Allied forces alone. But they didn't expect that an unforeseen party would join the fight against them. When the American, British, and Chinese leaders met to put an end to Japan's expansionist efforts, the Soviet Union was still bound by a pact of neutrality that both nations had signed early in World War II. But that was about to change. As soon as the Third Reich fell, Joseph Stalin supported the Allied effort in the Pacific Ocean. However, the Soviet Navy was not nearly as prepared to fight the mighty Imperial Japanese Navy as its American counterpart. As such, the United States began sending them dozens of ships and personnel from Alaska, a highly classified operation known as Project Hula. Word of Honor. In April of 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed the Neutrality Pact, although they kept their forces on their borders, as both nations had had a complex history of tensions. That June, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and by the end of the year, Japan had attacked the United States and the Allies throughout the Pacific. Even so, Japan and the Soviet Union avoided military operations against each other. The Japanese did not deliberately interfere with the Lend-Lease convoys sent from the US to help the Soviets with their massive military, civilian, and economic losses, and in turn, the Soviets did not allow the Americans to base their aircraft on their territory. In fact, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin maintained that his nation could not aid the Allies against Japan until Germany was defeated. Then, at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, he agreed to support the Allies in the Pacific War 3 months after the fall of the Nazis, whenever that happened. As the war raged on, the defeat of Nazi Germany seemed imminent, and soon the Soviets would have to fulfill their promise. Negotiations. In late 1944, Japan still had about 500,000 troops stationed in China, a force comparable to Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Even so, Japan was struggling to consolidate its position and secure the supply lines it desperately needed. Moreover, its Axis partner, Germany, was crumbling too, finally capitulating in May of 1945. If the Soviets were to honor Stalin's word, they would have to declare war on Japan by August 9th. The Japanese had been left to fend for themselves and were particularly interested in extending the peace with their northern neighbors, even persuading them to negotiate with the Allies on their behalf in exchange for tantalizing territorial concessions. In turn, the Soviets let the Japanese' hopes grow as they showed no signs of engaging, but they were actually preparing their forces. Then, on July 26th, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Harry Truman, and Chairman Chiang Kai-shek demanded that Japan surrender. However, the proud Japanese avoided responding to the declaration while they awaited the Soviets' response. Still, they kept the Trans-Siberian Railway traffic under close monitoring, as well as Soviet activity to the east of Manchuria. The Japanese did not have any clue as to whether an invasion would occur or not, but the Soviets' delaying tactics led them to believe they would definitely not be able to attack them in late 1945 or even early 1946. They would soon be proven wrong. Project Hula. Unlike the Americans, who had hopped virtually every island in the Pacific and participated in major naval invasions like Normandy, the Soviets had only executed small naval operations in the Crimean Peninsula and a few other locations. Not only did they lack the experience, but also the strength in both manpower and material resources to undertake a naval invasion against the fierce Japanese military. As such, the United States resolved to offer its allies added support on top of the annual Lend-Lease allotments it already provided. Soon, the Soviets handed over a list of equipment they needed, which the Americans codenamed Milepost. The agreement, settled on December 20th, 1944, included the burrowing of a dozen types of ships and aircraft the Americans would transfer to the USSR, as well as a training program for the amateur Soviet crews. Thus was born Project Hula, the secretive transfer of 180 ships across Cold Bay in the Alaskan Peninsula. The ships. The most capable vessels that would be delivered to the Soviets were 30 1,415-ton Tacoma-class patrol frigates, fully optimized for anti-submarine operations, each equipped with 3 3-inch guns, multiple flak cannons, and depth charges. A fleet of 34 similarly armed Admirable-class minesweepers was to support the main warships, although less than half were in displacement. Also, 92 smaller submarine chasers and wooden auxiliary motor torpedo boats, in addition to 4 hulking floating workshops, would serve by offering repairs at sea. Moreover, arguably the most crucial donation was that of 30 large landing craft infantry, with ramps that could convey and deliver over 200 soldiers onto a beachhead. Deliveries of the equipment began in April of 1945, and by the last day of July, the Soviets had received well over 100 ships to aid them in their fight against the Japanese. The odds had turned against an enemy who expected a weak attack. A modest assault force. Within a week of the last ships arriving in the USSR, the Soviet forces rolled through Manchuria. Having defeated the Nazi threat in the west, a buildup of 90 divisions advanced over 450 kilometers in a matter of days, managing to outwit the fierce Japanese resistance. On the night of August 15th, the Soviet High Command resolved to occupy the northern Kuril Islands, Shumshu and Paramushir. Unsurprisingly, the task became the responsibility of the Kamchatka Peninsula Army and Navy forces. The obstacles were formidable, and the assault force would have to land on Shumshu Island within 48 hours. But the commanders knew that keeping their forces intact after a 170-mile trek between the staging area and the objective in the world's foggiest waters would be almost impossible. Although Major General A.R. Gnechko of the Kamchatka Defense Zone obtained a solicited 24-hour postponement, the troops were hastily briefed on the objective and soon boarded their landing ships, transports, and self-propelled barges. In a matter of hours, Captain First Rank Dmitry G. Ponomarev had assembled 64 ships in Avacha Bay. The Soviet forces amounted to 8,824 officers and men, and according to their intelligence, Shumshu held about 8,500 troops, plus reinforcements of roughly 15,000 soldiers on the nearby island. The invaders expected to find a demoralized garrison, which nonetheless outnumbered them 3-1. Moreover, the enemy had 77 tanks, while they had none, and their artillery and mortars would be rendered useless should they fail to secure a beachhead. Gnechko's inferior force and the utter lack of heavy naval guns demanded a concentrated attack, meaning that the Okhotsk minesweeper, equipped with only 3 130mm and 2 76 2mm guns, had to provide fire support across 12 kilometers from Cape Lopatka. Even so, the fleet's ability to keep station and supply fire support remained doubtful. After all, they faced mighty currents on top of a robust enemy shore defense. First wave. The operation began at 5 a.m. on August 17th, and in less than 24 hours, the strike force had entered the first Kuril Strait and taken up their positions. The first wave then came in, and about 1,000 men from the Naval Infantry Battalion waded ashore before dawn. The Japanese were utterly surprised, but the Soviets' lack of tactical combat experience and amphibious training soon became evident. Instead of securing the beach, the small units made uncoordinated advances inland, and lousy weather rendered their air support obsolete. Within an hour, the Japanese emplacements began to inflict severe casualties on the invaders. Even worse, the Soviet attempt to destroy the shore batteries took longer than expected and was met with strong resistance. The first wave also tried to smother the shore batteries on Cape Koktan, but was outnumbered and outmatched, facing a Japanese counterattack with infantry and 20 tanks. Remarkably, the Soviet naval infantrymen managed to destroy 15 enemy tanks, but they were repulsed before reaching the peak. Gnechko's fears had been proven right. As the enemy defenses wreaked havoc on the amphibious force, naval gunfire support was futile. Unconditional surrender. At 9 a.m., the second wave, spearheaded by 16 American infantry landing craft, unloaded on the beach, but without most of its radios and all of its artillery and mortars. 10 minutes later, the Soviet units on Shumshu were able to establish communications with their ships, and Cape Lopatka, turning the odds. Intense fire pummeled the enemy, while the battered naval infantrymen held out. Moreover, the weather finally improved, and Soviet air support halted the flow of enemy reinforcements from Paramashir. The coordinated effort between the ground, naval, and air forces inflicted heavy losses on the defenders. By nightfall, the Soviets, reinforced by artillery and mortars, had secured a beachhead 4 kilometers in length and as deep as 5 to 6 kilometers. They also held the western slopes of both key heights and wiped out most of the resistance in the shore batteries. The heavy artillery arrived the following morning, but several pockets of defenders had already surrendered. An envoy then informed the attackers that the Japanese would cease hostilities at 4 p.m., and the garrisons at Shumshu, Paramashir, and the nearby Onakutan Island signed an unconditional surrender agreement at 6 p.m. Sporadic skirmishes continued for 4 days, until the last man standing finally gave up. Having secured the islands, the Soviets would go on to occupy the rest of the archipelago easily. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to Dark Seas and the rest of our Dark Documentaries channels, where we delve into many more epic stories from modern history. And make sure to activate the notifications bell to stay tuned.